The conference room in Geneva was filled with the world's most powerful men and women. Flags hung like symbols of old promises and broken ones. Cameras flashed as the Secretary-General welcomed everyone. But all lenses were drawn to two figures, two men who, despite never having met before, were now locked in a war of ideologies. On one side sat Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's long-standing prime minister, sharp in both tongue and policy. On the other, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the defiant leader of Burkina Faso, whose rise had unsettled the old order of Western diplomacy. The summit had been called to discuss global security. But behind the speeches and diplomatic gestures, there was an undercurrent of conflict, Africa's growing resistance to Western control, and the West's tightening grip on what remained. Netanyahu spoke first. His voice was cold, measured. "Let me be clear, Israel does not wait for permission. We occupy without mercy when our interests are at stake." The words echoed through the hall like the hiss of a blade being drawn. Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, as if weighing the weight of history itself on his shoulders. He looked around, not at Netanyahu, but at the faces of silent leaders who had long tolerated such arrogance. Then he leaned forward. "Then may you also die without honor," he said, calm but cutting, like stone splitting beneath pressure. Gasps filled the hall. A few diplomats shifted in their seats. Netanyahu narrowed his eyes. The tension in the room was now thick enough to crush protocol. What no one yet realized was that this was more than a clash of personalities. It was a collision of centuries, of colonizer and colonized, occupier and resistor, arrogance and ancestral rage. And the world was watching. The silence that followed Traoré's words was louder than any explosion. Diplomats blinked in disbelief. A few glanced toward the exit, uncertain whether they were witnessing the spark of a scandal, or the start of something far more dangerous. Netanyahu, ever the tactician, offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We don't need honor, we have power." That was his mistake. Traoré tilted his head. There was no smile on his face, just the steady gaze of a man who had stood against empires and watched them tremble. "You confuse fear with respect," he replied. "But your power is borrowed. From weapons, from wealth, from walls. Ours comes from the soil beneath our feet and the ancestors who bled into it." Across the room, journalists began to whisper. A CNN reporter scribbled notes furiously. The African delegates, often silent in such meetings, sat taller now. This wasn't just a statement, it was a shift. The Secretary-General tried to defuse the moment with a forced chuckle. "Perhaps we should move on to economic cooperation," but it was too late. The room had already split, not just politically, but morally. Later, in a quiet corridor of the summit building, Traoré was approached by a young African delegate from Namibia. His voice trembled with emotion. "Captain, you said what many of us have only dared to whisper." Traoré placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then speak louder, let them hear you." What Netanyahu didn't know was that this summit would become the battlefield of stories. His legacy of militarism was about to collide with Traoré's rebellion of words. And in a world starved of courage, truth, spoken boldly, was starting to look like revolution. That evening, a private dinner was arranged for the summit leaders, an exclusive room lined with velvet curtains, golden cutlery, and polished egos. Invitations were selective. Netanyahu arrived early. Traoré, fashionably late. As he entered, all conversation paused. It wasn't just his presence, it was the symbolism. A 35-year-old revolutionary walking into a space built for 70-year-old empire builders. Some tried to mask their discomfort with smiles. Others didn't bother. Netanyahu raised a glass in mock welcome. "To our African guest, may he learn that diplomacy is a more delicate tool than defiance." A few chuckles rose from the table. But Traoré remained composed. He scanned the room, then slowly poured water into his own glass. "Diplomacy without dignity is just well-dressed servitude," he said. The laughter stopped. At the far end of the table, the French foreign minister cleared his throat. "Captain Traoré, surely you understand, Israel faces unique challenges. Its actions are necessary." Traoré looked at him, then at Netanyahu. "Every empire calls its violence necessary. The pharaohs said the same. So did the colonizers who built your railways on our bones. This wasn't just a retort, it was an accusation aimed at the entire architecture of the room. After dinner, Netanyahu approached Traoré in the hallway. His tone was different now, measured, cautious. "You're playing a dangerous game, Captain." Traoré stopped, eyes steady. "It's not a game if your people are dying." There it was, the line between theater and truth. And Netanyahu, for all his years in power, recognized something chilling. Traoré wasn't posturing, he was preparing. From that moment on, the Israeli leader realized he wasn't just dealing with a charismatic African officer. He was facing an idea that refused to be silenced. And it was growing. While the world saw staged smiles and ceremonial handshakes, behind the summit's locked doors, the real war unfolded, not of bullets, but of influence. Intelligence advisors from the US whispered into earpieces. The French ambassador passed silent notes, but all eyes kept drifting back to Traoré. They had underestimated him. That night, in a secured wing of the summit hotel, Netanyahu convened a private strategy meeting. Inside were hand-picked diplomats, defense contractors, and a Mossad operative. "He's more than a nuisance," Netanyahu said, voice low. "He's a symbol, and symbols become movements." The Mossad agent nodded. "He's triggering a narrative we haven't seen since Sankara. The youth are watching him. The global south listens when he speaks." Netanyahu paced. "Then we need to change the story, make him the villain." Meanwhile, in his suite on the opposite side of Geneva, Traoré sat with a map of Africa spread across a table. He wasn't resting, he was planning. "They want us divided," he told his aide, Malik. "Nation by nation, leader by leader. But we are one people scattered, not broken." He pointed to the Sahel, then West Africa, then Central Africa. "The minerals under our soil built their skyscrapers. Our silence bought their weapons. That ends now." Just then, a knock at the door. A courier delivered a sealed envelope. Inside, an anonymous letter. "You've made powerful enemies. Leave Geneva, or you won't leave alive." Malik froze. Traoré smiled, faintly. "Then we're finally saying something worth hearing." He burned the letter over a candle. Ashes drifted toward the open window as Geneva's skyline shimmered in the distance, beautiful, fragile, and completely unaware that something was shifting beneath its marble floors. Tomorrow, the summit would enter its final day. But for Netanyahu and Traoré, it would be more than a conclusion. It would be confrontation. The final morning of the summit dawned with artificial calm. Outside the grand hall, reporters gathered like vultures sensing blood. Inside, the delegates moved like actors in a play where the ending had already been rewritten. But Traoré had a script of his own. As attendees took their seats, the moderator announced a surprise: "We now open the floor to closing statements. President Netanyahu has requested to speak." Netanyahu stood, polished as ever. "Let us remember," he began, "that peace comes not from passion, but from power. From order, from strength, from the resolve to act when others hesitate." He paused, then glanced directly at Traoré. "And when young leaders mistake loud words for leadership, they invite chaos, not change." A few clapped, Western allies, old guards, but many remained still. Traoré rose next. He didn't walk to the podium. He stayed at his table, voice firm, tone deliberate. "They call us inexperienced because we don't bow. They call us unstable because we won't be bought." He held up a piece of paper, a contract proposal that had circulated behind closed doors. "This was handed to me yesterday. It offered strategic partnerships, in exchange for exclusive mining rights and military corridors. The same old colonial leash in a new color." Murmurs swept through the hall. Cameras zoomed in. "We've seen this before. You fund the weapons, stir the conflict, then sell us peacekeeping. You destabilize, then offer to rebuild. That is not diplomacy. That is domination." The hall had grown deathly quiet. "Africa is not your chessboard, and I am not your pawn." He sat down. The silence that followed was thunderous. Some delegates began to clap. Not the usual polite applause, but slow, firm, defiant. It started with the African Union representatives, then Latin America, then Southeast Asia, even a few from Eastern Europe. Netanyahu didn't react. But behind his eyes, the storm had begun. This wasn't just a summit anymore. It was a stage, and Traoré had stolen the spotlight. That night, the summit ended, but the story didn't. As leaders boarded planes, signed statements, and posed for photos, a different operation was underway. In the basement level of a government-owned hotel, a meeting without minutes was taking place. Netanyahu's aides, a French intelligence attaché, and a high-ranking U.S. official gathered with cold expressions. Traoré's influence is spreading faster than we projected, said the Frenchman. His speech trended in 47 countries within 3 hours, added the American. Hashtags, #AfricaRising, #Traoré Unleashed. Netanyahu listened, eyes narrowed. We don't just need to silence his words, he said. We need to stain his name. They had done it before, with leaders who stood in the way. Character assassination was more effective than physical. We plant a story, said the U.S. official. Offshore accounts. Backdoor arms deals. Make him look like what they fear most, another corrupt strongman. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, a very different scene unfolded. Traoré's plane touched down in Ouagadougou to an unexpected sight. Tens of thousands of people gathered, waiting. The runway, the roads, the rooftops, packed with flags, drums, chants. He stood in front of the world, one woman shouted. And he didn't blink. The convoy moved slowly through the city. Children waved handmade signs, we are not pawns, our voice, our soil, our future. Inside the car, Malik showed Traoré a phone. Sir, they've started the smear campaign. The headline was in bold. Exclusive, leaked documents tie Traoré to Russian mercenaries. And so it begins, Traoré murmured. They think this will break us? Malik looked at him. Will it? Traoré smiled, faintly. No. It'll only expose how scared they really are. Because in the game of global power, when the truth stands tall, lies scatter like rats in sunlight, the headlines multiplied like wildfire. Traoré's secret pact with China revealed. Sources say Burkina Faso trading gold for weapons. UN investigates alleged human rights abuses under Traoré's rule. The accusations were surgical, crafted for Western media consumption. Not enough to accuse, just enough to raise eyebrows. CNN aired a special investigation. BBC brought on former diplomats who just had a feeling that Traoré was turning authoritarian. Politico published a think piece titled, Is Traoré the next Mugabe, or something worse? The plan was working, except in one place. Africa. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, people had seen this movie before. Leaders rise, speak truth, challenge old powers, then suddenly become villains. The continent had learned to read between the lines. In Ghana, a youth-led protest blocked a French embassy for 3 hours. In Kenya, students painted murals of Traoré beside Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. In Nigeria, a trending video showed a man burning a newspaper. They lied about him. Just like they lied about all of them. Meanwhile, Traoré held a press conference, not to deny, but to confront. He stood before a sea of cameras in a simple military uniform. No flag behind him. No prepared script. Just his voice. They say I took money from China. I did take something, from every nation willing to treat us as equals. Knowledge. Technology. Tools to build, not bombs to destroy. They say I'm corrupt. My only wealth is in the villages we've electrified, the children we've fed, and the mines we took back from foreign hands. And they say I'm dangerous. To whom? He paused. If justice is dangerous, if self-respect is dangerous, then let it be known, I am very dangerous. The room erupted. Not in applause, but in stunned silence. Journalists who had come expecting spin had heard conviction. A rare thing in the halls of power. And somewhere, far from the cameras, Netanyahu watched the broadcast. His whisper was bitter. He's not falling. In a private room inside the Knesset, Netanyahu sat with 3 advisors, all staring at a silent screen where Traoré's press conference had just ended. He's turning their tools against them, one said. The more we attack, the stronger he becomes, muttered another. Netanyahu stood and walked to the window. He's rewriting the narrative, and we no longer own the ink. But he still had allies. Calls were made to Paris, to London, to Washington. Economic levers were pulled. Aid packages were delayed. Contracts were reviewed. An IMF loan was quietly suspended. The message was clear: Burkina Faso would bleed, slowly. But what they didn't count on was what Traoré had already built. Instead of collapsing, Burkina Faso adapted. When France halted shipments of medical supplies, Cuba and Algeria filled the gap. When the IMF froze funds, Traoré launched a national initiative, Gold for Growth, redirecting revenues from state-controlled mines to fund local infrastructure, paid directly in gold bullion. No more begging, he said in a radio address. We trade what we have, not what they allow. And the people followed. Teachers volunteered unpaid hours. Farmers donated portions of their crops to urban centers. Mechanics, nurses, engineers, all stepped forward. It wasn't patriotism. It was something deeper. Pride. In Jerusalem, Netanyahu's next move was not diplomacy. It was deterrence. We need to show him the cost of defiance, he told Mossad officials. He won't survive if we isolate him from the inside. Traoré's own inner circle would become the battlefield. They began contacting old contacts in Burkina Faso's military, those who had benefited under French rule, who resented Traoré's rise from a captain to a people's champion. Bribes were offered. Threats whispered. False intelligence leaked. It wasn't an invasion. It was infiltration. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré met privately with Maurice Sankara, his security chief and former enemy. They've changed their tactic, said Sankara. They don't want to kill you, Ibrahim. They want someone else to pull the trigger for them. Traoré nodded. Then we find that someone, before they pull the trigger. Maurice Sankara had seen betrayal wear many masks, some smiled, some saluted, some prayed. But the kind that terrified him most was the kind that stayed silent. He handed Traoré a dossier marked in red. Operation Clay Vein, intercepted Mossad communications revealing a plot to finance a palace coup through 3 mid-ranking generals. One of them is already in your Security Council, said Sankara. The others are waiting for your signal to move, and theirs to strike. Traoré read in silence. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't flinch. They want me to fall by the hands of my own, he murmured. To make the world say, Africa cannot govern itself. In the palace courtyard, he convened an emergency midnight meeting. 3 generals stood before him. 2 of them were clean. 1 was not. But none of them knew who he suspected. You have served this country, Traoré began, through storms and fire. But today, he added, stepping closer, I ask you only one thing: when history names the traitor, will your children recognize your name? One of the generals looked down. That was enough. Within hours, Burkina Faso's intelligence operatives raided a hidden compound on the city's outskirts. Inside, satellite phones, Israeli-grade encryption devices, a large sum of foreign currency, and a forged resignation letter for President Traoré, ready to be announced, due to health reasons. The plot unraveled fast. The captured general confessed under pressure. He had been promised asylum in Tel Aviv, a new identity, and a role in rebuilding the new administration. Netanyahu's people called it a soft reset, he muttered. Traoré stood before his National Guard the next morning. Not as a victim, but as a firewall. They do not fear my army, he told them. They fear my example. Let them come with dollars, with drones, with stories. We will stand with dust in our mouths and fire in our chests. In Jerusalem, Netanyahu's advisors begged him to pull back. He's too resilient, one said. Every plan we make becomes his weapon. But Netanyahu's voice was ice. Then we stop planning. And start warning. 3 weeks passed. Burkina Faso did not collapse. It did not bend. And the world noticed. Countries that had once ignored Traoré began to call. Not to lecture, but to learn. Mali and Niger expanded joint security treaties. South Africa invited him for a state visit. Even Brazil expressed interest in resource collaboration without colonial strings. The tide was shifting. Netanyahu felt it. Not in headlines, but in silence. The kind of silence empires hear just before their voice no longer matters. So he tried one last thing. At the UN Security Council, Israel presented a resolution condemning authoritarian aggression and destabilizing influence by African leaders aligned with non-Western powers. Everyone knew who they meant. And still, it failed. Abstained. Rejected. Dead on arrival. Then, in a bold, reckless move, Netanyahu issued a statement on Israeli state media. We occupy without mercy because we know the price of weakness. If leaders like Traoré think they can defy history, they will become its forgotten footnotes. The clip went viral. And 2 hours later, so did Traoré's response. He stood not behind a podium, but among his people, in the red dust of the village where he was born. Cameras surrounded him. No script. No teleprompter. Just fire. You claim to occupy without mercy? Then you shall die without honor. He let the words hang, like smoke from a rifle. You speak of history. But your history was built on walls, barbed wire, bulldozers, and bones. Ours was built on survival. On refusing to die. On knowing that dignity is not granted, it is seized. The world watched in awe. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #TraoréTruth and #DieWithoutHonor trended worldwide. In Harlem, murals of Traoré went up overnight. In Palestine, youth groups quoted his speech. In Paris, French citizens protested their government's silence on Africa's plunder. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu stared at a dark screen. No words. No press team. Just silence. Because for the first time, the world didn't fear the empire's anger. It respected the rebels' clarity. And in Ouagadougou, as night fell over the land Traoré called home, he stood beneath a flag that had never flown under foreign rule. The final chapter wasn't written in blood. It was written in defiance.